Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, Civic Responsibility, and welcome to the year 2016. This is, as makes sense, this is our first broadcast of the new year. It is Monday. It is the 4th day of January in the year 2016, and I was telling a number of folks over the weekend that we'll be moving towards early March. And at the end of March, that will be 3 years we've been doing these programs. I absolutely cannot believe it. I am so excited, and I'm so excited about the new year. We got a little bit of snow on the ground here. Winter has finally arrived here in Appalachia, and it is just delightful. I am so happy that you were able to join us today on this Monday, early in the year 2016. I do invite you to participate actively in our program. We would love to hear from you on some of the issues of the day. We'll go into these in a moment. Some of the issues that we've been dealing with, and hopefully gain a few insights on a few things that maybe all of us have thought about, but maybe we haven't thought about them in quite the same way. Anyway, we do have a phone number. We would love to hear from you. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. And as you know, 4676 translates into HORN. So our phone number, if you choose to call, and I do encourage you to do so, area code 304-663-HORN, HORN. If you would like to share your thoughts, your ideas with me directly via email, I would love to hear from you. I promise that I will acknowledge your email and respond in kind as best I can. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN, 906@gmail.com. And finally, I want to remind you that we do have a Facebook page devoted to the Virtual Center. If you go to Facebook and you type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will be into our Facebook page. And there are a number of entries there, some of them extensive because they are lengthy pieces that I've put together on a number of different topics. Most of them are topics that we've dealt with here at the Virtual Center. And I felt the need to commit them to print because I really believe that should people want to keep them, save them, copy and paste, whatever you choose to do with them, the opportunity is there. I do also encourage you to comment on many of the pieces that are there. So again, I do encourage you to go to our Facebook page. I've tried to, over the last several weeks, I've tried to be much more faithful in terms of posting items on Facebook for a number of reasons. I had a particular piece that I put up there to celebrate New Year's. I actually want to open the program with that. Then yesterday, late yesterday, I posted. A thought had occurred to me about the current 2016 campaign, at least the Republican side of the political campaign. And, something occurred to me that I thought was really worth throwing up on Facebook. Again, not necessarily to tell people anything or share anything substantive with them, but to throw out this idea with the hope that it would give people an opportunity to respond. So again, I do invite you to visit our Facebook page. There, all of these things that I've posted are there for to give you an opportunity to not only read them and think about them, but hopefully respond to them. And the response can be via our phone number, which again is 304-663-HORN, HORN, or if you'd like to drop me an email, waobrien906@gmail.com. And again, you can always message me. There is a message opportunity there on Facebook. And if you are a Facebook user, you can message me on a particular piece if you choose to do that. I mentioned that there are a number of issues that I wanted to deal with, and I thought that I would at least begin today's program and begin this new year with, first of all, a sincere Happy New Year to everybody, and I mean that. I look forward to this new year. I usually do look forward to each new year. 2015 was a tough year. I think most of us will agree. There are a lot of things that it seems to me disturb us greatly. But again, I think it's very important that we maintain a very optimistic attitude towards some of the things, and that where possible we take some of these issues on within our own little venue, our own little piece of the world. There's always a possibility that we can contribute something positive to it. First, I'd like to visit the piece that I put on Facebook at New Year's. And basically, I was trying to say something other than Happy New Year, but at the same time, I did want to wish everybody on Facebook a Happy New Year. And I was reading poetry as I frequently do. I have 7 or 8 books of poems that I love to go to, and again, depending on my particular state of mind at the time, I usually like to go to these. And in reading one particular poem, and in fact, I'm going to go directly to the book right now, because the piece that I put on Facebook was not the beginning of the poem. It was rather the second stanza of the poem. The title of the poem is Hold Fast Your Dreams. The author, Louise Driscoll. And I was reading this because I was taken, given the fact that it was New Year's and given the fact that I was trying to be optimistic about the New Year's, I basically focused in on the title, Hold Fast Your Dreams. And I read the first stanza, and again, it was all about keeping your dreams alive, and I like that. Let me read to you that first stanza. Hold fast your dreams. Within your heart, keep one still, secret spot where dreams may go, and sheltered so may thrive and grow where doubt and fear are not. Oh, keep a place apart within your heart for little dreams to go. And I thought that really is a very, very positive message, the kind of message that I'd like to send folks on New Year's. And then I continued reading, and I read the second stanza, and I thought the second stanza might be actually a little bit more appropriate, may come a little bit closer to what I wanted to say than indeed the first stanza. Although again, it did pretty much meet my expectations as part of a New Year message. And this is the piece that I put on Facebook. This is the second stanza of Louise Driscoll's poem, Hold Fast Your Dreams. And she writes, think still of lovely things that are not true. Let wish and magic work at will in you. Be sometimes blind to sorrow. Make believe. Forget the calm that lies in disillusioned eyes. Though we all know that we must die, yet you and I may walk like gods and be even now at home in immortality. I thought that the message that I really wanted to send after I read these was the idea of magic, the idea of make-believe, the idea of pretending. And in a sense, that element within all of us seems to me the way that all of us ought to go into a new year. We know bad things are going to happen. And we know they're going to disturb us. But hopefully, in our own little piece of the world, there may be ways in which all of us can contribute something to make these negatives a little bit less negative and to make positives a little bit more pronounced and a little bit more visible for more people. As I think back to our programs at the Virtual Center over the last several months, and the thing that's on my mind right now, of course, is specifically the issues we've dealt with James Madison, with Thomas Jefferson, and in our most recent programs with John Locke. And one of the things I've found in all of those is the very positive element in all of those source materials that indicate that in spite of the realities that all of them deal with, each of them seems to put forth for all of us a positive message, a belief in the positives. Madison, for example, in the Federalist Papers. There's so much in the Federalist Papers to indicate that a rather negative view of human nature really contributed to the structure of the Constitution and the operation, the procedures associated with the Constitution of the United States. We spent quite a bit of time talking about the ideas of separation of powers and the checks and balances system within the Constitution that made separation of powers a reality in our political system. And all of it, as we know, was meant to address Madison's concern about the danger and the violence of factions, so to speak. The idea that self-interest, when it predominates, is going to seek self-interest of others who are after the same things. And organized self-interest becomes factionalism. And factionalism in our political system can be very dangerous. And that's the message that those who have been able to dominate our interpretation of the past have chosen to send us. They have basically chosen to send us a message that man's nature is driven by self-interest almost exclusively, if not totally exclusively. And that therefore, the nature of the constitutional system within which we live must be driven by the realities of human nature, which are defined as dark, self-interested, and potentially negative in terms of their impact on the public interest. Madison makes the point, for example, that by definition, factions, because they are driven by self-interest, are never in the public interest, so to speak, because they only appeal to a particular group of people, and that usually means that they are realized at the expense of the majority of the people. And of course, we know that government's principal job is to address and govern in the name of the public interest. So when self-interest dominates, the public interest takes a back seat. That just seems to be the way it goes. But as we know in Madison, there is a more positive element to Madison's thinking. He acknowledges in one of the Federalist Papers, which we've spent a lot of time on, it's not that frequently looked at. It's one of the Federalist Papers that tends to fall through the cracks in terms of priorities. It seems to me very significant that the Federalist Papers that have become priorities in most cases are those which speak to this negative self-interested definition of human nature. that seems to drive the checks and balances and separation of powers system in our Constitution. And Federalist number 55 is one that very, very few people mention or draw attention to. In that particular Federalist paper, Madison makes the point, he acknowledges the existence of self-interest. He acknowledges the negative aspects, the factional implications of self-interest in human nature. But at the same time, he points out that there are other features of human nature which counterbalance and offset the negatives. And it's these more positive aspects of human nature, Madison says in number 55, that we must rely on if we are to believe that popular government, Republican government in this country can survive and flourish. And so even Madison makes the point that while there are negatives, there are also positives. And the most important thing we can do is emphasize those positives and not allow those who have self-interested reasons to emphasize the negatives to dominate the conversation. And that is indeed what has happened. We have allowed those whose interest is self-interest to dictate to us how we interpret human nature. We know that psychologists and psychiatrists continue to do research in order to contribute to man's effort to really understand the elements of human nature. We know that the book is not closed. We continue to find out new things as the research continues to pile up. Bottom line, we know that a viable, definitive definition of human nature has yet to be found. Yet the fact of the matter is, our political system is based on the assumption that we know what makes up human nature, that we know the exact definition of human nature, and that it is negative, and that it is driven constantly, always by self-interest, and therefore man's behavior must be controlled. And within a popular government, it must be controlled through an internal system of checks and balances which make it difficult, if not impossible, for factionalism to actually gain control over our constitutional system. It's very relevant that James Madison himself alerts us to the fact that while self-interest is a factor, there are other more positive factors in human nature. And it's those more positive factors that we must rely on. They will determine the degree to which popular government in this nation can flourish. And of course, this is quite consistent with Thomas Jefferson's idea of the fact that the Creator, God created us, created man as a social being. And Jefferson says in one of his more famous letters, the Creator would be a bungler if God believed that man was to be a social animal. In other words, to live and flourish within organized societies. And yet the Creator did not give man the abilities to function within a social environment. And of course, the ways to function within a social environment are elsewhere defined by Jefferson and others as the idea of a moral sense, a conscience. All of us are given a conscience. All of us internally know, Jefferson believed, the differences between right and wrong, good and bad. We don't need someone to tell us. Excuse me. We don't need someone to tell us what good and bad are, what positive and negative are. We know. Jefferson says that we know intuitively, instinctively. We don't need to be told. In fact, Jefferson even argues that the more sophisticated our education is, in other words, the more education an individual receives, the more an individual learns the strategies, the techniques for manipulating situations. And so the fact of the matter is, Jefferson believes we're much more likely to gain direct insight into good, into positive, if we look to those who are operating by instinct rather than look to those who are operating according to what they've learned, to cognitive skills, the ability to manipulate situations, and the ability to define self-interested agendas and seek their successful accomplishment. Jefferson says, if you give the same question to a professor and a plowman, it's more likely that you'll come closer to the truth from the plowman than you will from the professor, because the professor is going to be driven by the manipulative skills that are part of the education that particular person received. Whereas the plowman is going to address the situation purely from instinct, from what is within him, from his gut, so to speak. Excuse me. And Jefferson argues that chances are we're much more likely to get at the truth by trusting in man's instincts, his internal sense of right and wrong, the idea of conscience, which ought to control human behavior if we let it. And so all of these things seem to me to fit into a very, very positive worldview. It seems to me that as everybody enters a new year, as we enter a new year, and people continue to make resolutions about the new year, most people go into the new year with the idea that positive things are going to happen in their lives, that they're going to address negatives and turn them into positives. The fact that many of us end up not making it in many of these resolutions, it seems to me, is given too much credibility, is given too much attention. The mere fact that we try, the mere fact that people continue to make reservations and continue to lay out an agenda for themselves, which is going to make the coming year better than the past one, seems to me to validate Jefferson's analysis, Madison's analysis in Federalist Number 55, much more than it does the negative one. Consequently, it seems to me, when you look at Louise Driscoll's poem, and she talks about making sure that whatever happens in our lives, we create or we leave a little place within us for magic, for the place where we can continue to hope and dream. That, to be very honest with you, is my wish for the new year. And that's why I selected this particular portion of Louise Driscoll's, I think, beautiful little poem. There's one other piece that I put on Facebook, and I think I put this in sometime late yesterday. And it deals with the current election campaign, especially the campaign on the Republican side of the ledger. As I was looking at the so-called the news broadcast, the news programs that seem to dominate Sunday morning television, Face the Nation and Meet the Press and all of those. On one of them, I was struck by a particular comment that one of the participants made. I can't even remember who it was, but the comment kept nagging at me. Seem to be dealing with a little bit of the sniffles, and I apologize for the interruptions. And the comment that I refer to is basically the idea or the message that's coming from the leadership of the Republican Party on the quality of the candidates, the field of candidates that the Republican Party continues to have active within this particular 2016 presidential campaign. And if my numbers are correct, there are still 12 active candidates on the Republican side of the ledger that continue to be participants in this particular campaign, even though a number of them have not really been able to grab hold and move up in the polls. Many of them have been down in the 1%, 2%, 3% range consistently. The one that I'm thinking about right now is Jeb Bush. And one of the reports that I've seen in the last several days about campaign spending suggests that Jeb Bush has already spent something in the neighborhood of $60 million in this campaign so far, and he's not moved off the dime. He continues to register in the polls at something in the neighborhood of 3%. And generally the conclusion is that his donors, those that are backing him financially, are becoming a little bit upset because the money that they're putting into his campaign doesn't seem to be paying off. And consequently, the argument goes, this is causing a little bit of consternation among his backers, and it's putting quite a bit of pressure on Jeb Bush to do something dramatic in order to make a mark and begin to move up in the polls a little bit. And the fact of the matter is, the one consistent element of the Republican campaign so far is the dominance and the leadership of Donald Trump. We know for a brief period, Ben Carson roared to the front and actually, in a couple of polls, was leading Donald Trump. But the fact of the matter is, Trump was able to reclaim the lead, and his numbers continue to go up in the polls, as many of you know. We also know that mainstream Republicans, the leadership of the Republican Party, the Republican National Committee, for example, and its director, Reince Priebus, it has been reported, have been trying to find ways, strategies, to challenge Donald Trump successfully, because the general thinking amongst the Republican leadership is that if Donald Trump is ever able to get the nomination of the Republican Party in the 2016 presidential race, chances are the Republican Party will lose and lose badly. Generally speaking, and this is based on the traditions of our two-party system. Generally speaking, history tells us, our political history tells us, that whenever one of the two major parties is dominated by positions on issues which veer too far from the center, which begin to border on extreme, whether they be extreme right or extreme left, whether they be extremely liberal or extremely conservative, makes no difference. Elections are won, political tradition tells us, when a campaign is able to maintain its strength toward the center of the political spectrum. But whenever the campaign is driven too far away from center, whether it be left or whether it be right, you tend to alienate all of those on the other side of the political so-called the political center, and even some who are on your side. In other words, the further to the extreme your positions, your campaign is being directed, the more of the electorate you tend to lose. And so what you are doing is handing the election to the other party. The strength of our political system, of our two-party system, throughout its history, has been its ability to bring both parties toward the center. By definition, then, it fulfills the message of Madison to instigate or initiate dialogue, deliberation, negotiation, compromise in our two-party system. And the closest, most contested elections between the two major parties exists when both parties tend to aim their message toward the center. Those are the competitive races. Those are the campaigns that seems to bring out the vote. They're heated, they're contested, they're controversial, they excite people, they invite a lot of people to become involved in the campaign itself. And consequently, they tend to bring out the largest percentage of eligible voters. When the pre-election polls tell us that the election is shaping up to be a landslide, that one party is seemingly running so far ahead of the other party that the election looks to be a landslide, that tends to discourage turnout, because many people believe that if the election is a lock even before it happens, then whether I vote or whether I don't vote doesn't matter. And so consequently, those kinds of elections seem to result in less turnout. Back to the point. The Republican National Committee, in the person principally of Reince Priebus, who's the director of the Republican National Committee, have been trying, as we know, for the last several months to come up with a strategy that would knock Donald Trump out of the leadership in this campaign. And as the campaign has gone on, more and more the pundits, more and more the experts are now beginning to speculate that Donald Trump might actually win this nomination. And that really instills fear in the Republican leadership because of the traditions. Donald Trump clearly is running a very extreme campaign. He's appealing to a very passionate minority within the Republican Party. The thinking is that if he is able to wrest the nomination of the Republican Party from all the other candidates, if he's able to win the nomination, then many Republican leaders believe that the Republican Party is in for a bloodbath in the fall election against the Democrats. Presumably, the Democratic candidate will be Hillary Clinton. At least that's the thinking. And so, in a sense, the Republican leadership is afraid that a Republican Party with Donald Trump as its candidate can't win in the final election. Because all of those people that are put off, that are frightened by the extreme, in fact, not only frightened, but frustrated and indeed, in some cases, disgusted by the positions on issues that Donald Trump is taking, that when they all come to the fore in November, the result will be a landslide victory for the Democrats. That's the fear. So basically, the Republican leadership has been searching for a way to successfully challenge Donald Trump. So far, they've been unable to find it. At the same time, the same Republican leadership has been bragging on the fact that there are so many candidates on the Republican side running for president. That whereas traditionally the major parties field 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 candidates for the nomination, in this year's election, the Republican Party started with, if my count is correct, 17. 17 candidates, all of whom believed that they had a shot at the nomination. And as we know over recent months, one by one, they have tended to drop out. The first dropout, if you will, was Rick Perry from Texas in the middle of the summer. I believe it was in July. And then the next victim to fall by the wayside in the Republican campaign, primary campaign, was Scott Walker, governor of Wisconsin. He dropped out, even though he had quite a war chest, largely due to Citizens United. And then after that, other candidates began to drop out. Bobby Jindal, governor of Louisiana. Lindsey Graham, most recently Lindsey Graham. I think he's the most recent dropout. And there was one other that, and right now I'm drawing a blank on the fifth one. But in my count, the way I count it, it started with 17. There are still 12. And now the first of the primaries, the Iowa caucuses, are looming very close. They're in February, as I believe. And so I think we're looking at around 5 weeks before votes are being cast. And even though we're getting that close to voting, Donald Trump still maintains that lead. Mainstream Republican Party has bragged on the quality when the issue comes up as to how many candidates there are. And they have argued that because there are so many, there are Republican governors, there are senators, there are congressmen, there are so many quality people in the Republican field. And Reince Priebus and others are given to brag on the quality of candidates that the Republicans have. And they point to the very small field in the Democratic Party and the extent to which Hillary Clinton, according to the polls, is running way ahead of Bernie Sanders and the ex-governor of Maryland as well. This is what dawned on me. This weekend, I heard some Republican pundit making the comment about the quality of the field in the Republican campaign. And it began to dawn on me. There's an irony here. And it seems to me the irony is that the size of the field is what is enabling Donald Trump to maintain his lead in the polls. As long as there is a field that large, there's no way to field an opposition to Donald Trump. With that many candidates vying for the nomination, by definition, the primary must focus on personality rather than issues. If you think of the Democratic debates that have been held so far, they tend to focus almost exclusively on issues. In fact, it took a while before differences between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton began to surface in these debates. At the very beginning, it was very difficult to separate them. Hillary Clinton was loath to criticize Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders was really not about criticizing Hillary Clinton either. They both seemed to take very similar positions on issues, although Bernie Sanders tend to be a little bit more to the extreme, a little bit more left than Hillary Clinton. But the pundits have been pointing out, and I think they're correct, that Bernie Sanders' success has been pulling Hillary Clinton more to the left than probably she would have gone if he hadn't been in the race. In other words, however far Bernie Sanders' campaign goes, even if he doesn't win, there's no question that his presence in the campaign and the crowds that Bernie Sanders is attracting have succeeded in putting his issues on the table like no candidate for the longest time has been able to do. And the only chance that Hillary Clinton has to maintain her lead has been to co-opt many of Bernie Sanders' positions in a number of issues. In other words, he's having an impact on the campaign, on the party platform to be developed, whether in fact he wins or not. But the fact of the matter is, the campaign has been, to a large extent, an issue-oriented campaign. On the other hand, the Republican campaign has focused almost exclusively on the personality of Donald Trump. It has remained a personality-driven campaign because there are so many people in the field that the candidates are almost forced to compete with each other rather than to solidify positions on key issues. The result is that the two campaigns have been quite different. Whereas the Democratic campaign has been issue-oriented, the Republican campaign has been personality-oriented. Now back to the whole idea of the campaign process itself. The whole idea in our system of popular government for political campaigns is to accomplish a number of things. Historically, what political campaigns have been able to do is solidify the political parties, the respective political parties, by debating issues to the point that the National Party's position on major issues that most affect the American electorate, the voters, begin to take shape as a result of the campaign. In other words, the campaign serves to educate voters on the issues. And in the process of debating those issues, the participants, the competitors for the nomination, in debating those issues, are educating the American people on the leadership qualities and potential of the candidates themselves. In other words, it makes it much easier for Democratic voters to vote intelligently because they've been exposed to the issues, they've been exposed to the debates over the issues, and they have been exposed to the particular candidates on the positions they take on those issues. And the result is that the campaign process itself has been an educational process for the electorate. On the Republican side, that educational process, as of yet, has not been able to happen, because the Republicans can't get to the issues so long as the field remains so large. As of now, it appears there are still 12 viable candidates. And I think we have to qualify the word viable because some of them aren't very viable. We understand that. But the fact of the matter is there are still 12 active candidates in the field. That means that when the next TV debate is held, there are still too many, likely too many, for all of them to be on the stage at the same time. Chances are the Republicans are going to have to stage the pre-debate that they've carried out before each of the previous debates. The debate among the candidates who are polling the lowest, in order to keep the number of those who appear on stage in the main event at a manageable level. In the last debate, there were 9 candidates on the stage. But there were, at that time, I believe, 5 candidates who didn't make it for the main event. They participated in the pre-debate debate. But the fact of the matter is the campaign has remained personality-driven. And the nature of the Trump campaign has been to take on one candidate after the other as they have emerged to challenge Donald Trump. And that's been the process that the Republican campaign thus far has been pursuing. One by one, the candidates are being driven out of the campaign. But the fact of the matter is the campaign's been going on now for 6 months, maybe a little bit longer than that, and there are still 12. Which means that the real Democratic campaign debates have yet to begin. Now we get to it seems to me, to the key variable, the key issue that seems to make all of this possible. And it's money. It's Citizens United. Most of us have opposed the decision in Citizens United because of the big money, the big donors that we fear Citizens United would make it possible for the big donors to establish inordinate interests in the campaign. Our fear was that big money would buy the candidates, that the candidates would become so beholden to big money contributors that the democratic process as we know it would become impossible. In fact, that's been one of the positions that Donald Trump has taken. His position has consistently been that he will not take money from big donors, from PACs, political action committees, because they own the candidates who do take their money. And Donald Trump's position is that he will fund his own campaign. Therefore, when he's elected, he says, he will be beholden to none of these people. And he'll be able to govern accordingly. The fact of the matter is, these big donors and the money that they've been pouring into the various campaigns has been the reason that so many Republican candidates are able to remain in the race. I call your attention to the previous presidential campaign, the election of 2012, specifically to the campaign of Newt Gingrich. If you can remember back to the 2012 campaign on the Republican side, Newt Gingrich was able to remain in the campaign much longer than the support he was receiving seemed to dictate. Under normal circumstances, and by normal circumstances I mean before Citizens United, Newt Gingrich's campaign would have run out of money. He wouldn't have had the resources to stay in the race. He would have been forced to drop out much earlier than he finally did. But because of the money that he was receiving from billionaire contributors, and the main one, as I recall, was Sheldon Adelson, the casino owner in Las Vegas, at whose hotel, the Venetian, the last Republican debate took place. Many of us are aware that many of the Republican candidates prior to the last debate had private meetings with Sheldon Adelson. And the fact of the matter is, Adelson's money has become so significant, his political support has become so important in the Republican campaign that candidates seem to be tripping over themselves in order to get on the good side of Sheldon Adelson. And it just so happens that the good side of Sheldon Adelson is successfully achieved principally based on the position a candidate takes on Israel. Adelson has made it very clear that any candidate that he supports must take a very pro-Israeli position in Middle Eastern affairs. So, in a sense, Citizens United is having the negative effect on our political process that many of us were afraid it would have. But the fact of the matter is, while it's true that big money seems to be buying particular candidates, in fact, we've heard a number of the names thrown around, it almost appears that most of the Republican candidates have been able to enlist their own political billionaire sugar daddy to fund their campaign. But the point is It's the existence of this big money and the ability of the majority of Republican candidates to enlist donors, big donors, behind their campaigns that has kept most of these people in the race. And the result of keeping so many candidates in the race, way beyond the point when the level of support that they're not getting would, under normal circumstances, have already caused them to drop out. That means that because there are so many candidates left, that the real campaign debate within the Republican Party has not yet happened. Consequently, the situation has enabled Donald Trump to maintain his dominant position in the campaign. Donald Trump's positions on issues, except for the broadest positions on some of the key issues, are unknown. Donald Trump has been spared the need to go into specifics on issues. As long as the campaign remains a personality-driven campaign, as long as Donald Trump can direct his campaign at his fellow Republican candidates and not at particular issues, then that has enabled him to maintain his huge lead in the polls. So the irony is that the very strength of the slate that the mainstream Republican Party brags about is the reason that Donald Trump is able to maintain his lead. And so long as the number of candidates remains large, Trump's campaign can remain personality-driven. And as long as it remains personality-driven, Trump is given the luxury of not being required to get into the issues. The result is that those Republican voters who are lining up behind one or the other candidate, whether it's Ben Carson, whether it's Donald Trump, whether it's Cruz, and obviously many of the others that are down towards the bottom, the fact of the matter is their loyalties are driven by personalities as well, not issues. Consequently, the educational process that campaigns traditionally perform has not yet begun in the Republican Party. I think it's incredibly important and incredibly, I think it really speaks to the nature of this political campaign. It's unlike any others we've had in so many ways because there are so many candidates and there's so much money available to these candidates that they don't have to drop out. They can stay viable even though they're not appealing to more than a very small percentage of registered Republicans. And the mainstream Republican Party is worried about that because that's not the way elections are won. Elections are won by issues that appeal to the majority of voters, all the voters on their side, plus enough on the other side to seal their successful campaign for the White House. Priebus and the others are concerned that it doesn't look like the Republican Party's ever going to get there. So they've been looking for ways to knock off Donald Trump. It can't happen as long as so many candidates remain viable. That's the position I think that's very important because it's driven by an understanding of the nature of American two-party politics. Once you understand that, I think you can see the consternation and the conflict within the Republican leadership. At the same time, they love all of these candidates being in there. It speaks to the strength of the leadership in the party. But on the other hand, they can't arrive at a candidate or two or three candidates. Once the slate gets down to two or three candidates, then the candidates will start debating issues. Then Donald Trump will no longer be able to focus on personalities and his one-liners, his negativism, his unbelievable attacks, driven by race, driven by religion, driven by a number of other things, will not work anymore. Until that happens, he's going to be able to maintain his lead, I do believe. It has just gone the top of the hour. It's 2 minutes after the top of the hour. I'd like to pause for our regular 5-minute break, as we usually do on Mondays and Wednesdays. And then when we return, I'd like to touch on a couple of issues I think you'll find very interesting and very informative. I know I did. These are particular issues that I think will help all of us pretty well firmly establish our feet on the ground, so to speak, on some of the major issues of the day. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We'll be right back.
We now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here again is Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to our second hour of our first program of the new year. Today is Monday, the 4th day of January in the year 2016. If you are just joining us, welcome to our program. Welcome to the new year. And let me take this opportunity to wish you a happy new year and to thank you for your continuing support of the Virtual Center. If you have been with us since the beginning of our program, I want to thank you for staying with us. And basically, if you are still with us, I like to believe it's because there's something in the first hour that has kept you with us. And I take that very, very seriously. It's a vote of confidence. I may be assuming, in some cases, it may be that some people out there don't have anything else to do, but I doubt that very, very seriously. Thank you so much for your continued support of the Virtual Center and for your ongoing support of the Head On Radio Networks, which makes this program and other programs on the network possible. For years, I did pledging for public broadcasting, both radio and television, here in West Virginia. I've done it for years. And, I truly believe that public broadcasting is a gift. And I have had no problem at all in soliciting funds, because I know that the quality of broadcasting on public broadcasting, whether it's radio or TV, it seems to me depends to a tremendous degree on private donations, the so-called listeners like you. Here on the Head On Radio Network, our programs are totally 100% dependent on listener participant support. So again, it's very important that you know how much we appreciate that ongoing support. I want to thank you for it, and I want to, hopefully, by the quality of our programming, make it clear that your support is being used appropriately. I trust that you will agree that that is true. We would love to hear from you as a participant. We have a phone number that is available for you should you want to get on the air and share your ideas, your thoughts, your questions, your concerns, whatever they might be, with us. Our phone number is area code 304-663-HORN, H-O-R-N, 4676. That's 304-663-4676. And again, that translates into Horn, Horn. If you would like to email me directly, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906 @gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN, 906 @gmail.com. And finally, I encourage you to check our Facebook page devoted to the Virtual Center. If you are on Facebook, just merely go to Facebook and type in the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, and you will have access to our Facebook page. And let me suggest to you that the most recent postings on that Facebook page are basically summaries of our first hour today. Our first hour today was pretty much my trying to expand on the two posts that were put on Facebook over this past weekend. The New Year's greeting with the particular stanza of the poem by Louise Driscoll, and a position on the nature of our two-party system as it's being played out in the current election campaign, principally looking at the at the Republican side of the picture, and most specifically at the number of candidates, viable candidates, still in the race for the Republican nomination. Again, should you choose to comment on either of those, I invite you to pick up the phone and give us a call right now, or if you're so inclined, to send me an email. I'll do the very best I can to respond to you. I know that at minimum, I will thank you for the time that it takes to send an email. And if I can respond appropriately and in kind to the substance of your email, I'll try to do that. And again, you are always welcome to make comments either online via email or on the air by using our phone number on issues that are addressed in our postings on Facebook. Over the weekend, I ran into two particular pieces of reading. Actually, I spent quite a bit of time reading this weekend, and actually quite a bit of time responding to comments and links sent to us by our listeners. I know Gene, one of our listeners, Gene, sends me almost every weekend 2 or 3 links to particular articles that he believes are particularly pertinent and particularly appropriate for our attention here at the Virtual Center. Over the months, I've made use of number of those for significant portions of our programs. I don't pretend to suggest that we can give due attention to all of them, because very honestly, there are a number of them. And I thank Gene so much for these. I check out every single one. In some cases, I oftentimes make a decision that maybe that's not an issue that we ought to go in, or very honestly, at times, these are issues that I really don't have anything more to say. In fact, I'm learning from the link, and I appreciate the opportunity to visit it, thanks to Gene. But oftentimes, and I think this makes perfect sense, oftentimes I don't have anything to add. I don't know that much about the issue. In fact, what little I know is what the piece or the link has told me. So, I don't really believe that in those cases, that I have anything to add. So therefore, I'm a little bit reluctant to put it on the air and just read the link. That doesn't seem to be very appropriate. It doesn't seem to challenge me to contribute to our overall understanding of some of these issues. So I'm much more comfortable addressing the issues that I feel competent in addressing, and I trust that Gene understands that. Anyway, there are 2 particular pieces that I came across over this previous weekend, and they are so different politically that I thought they were worthy of our attention here at the Virtual Center. One of them is a piece written by Parker Palmer. And let me tell you that I believe this is the New York Times, but I could be wrong. But I do believe it is. Let me tell you a little bit of why I was drawn particularly to Parker Palmer's piece. I don't know how many of you are comfortable or familiar with the name Parker Palmer. Parker Palmer is, the last I saw, a resident of Madison, Wisconsin. Like all of us, he's getting some years on him. I think we can all claim to that. I had the privilege a number of years ago, in fact, more than 25 years ago, because it was before I came to West Virginia in 1991. It was while I was teaching at the community college level in Virginia, which would have been mid to late 80s. I applied for and was admitted to a conference hosted by Parker Palmer. I was selected as a participant. And so for 4 days, I was involved 24 hours a day, round the clock, in one of the most insightful, invigorating, and informative conferences that I've ever attended in my life. And I was personally exposed to the magic of Parker Palmer. Mr. Palmer, Dr. Palmer, continues to write. He continues to publish. He's one of the greatest supporters and defenders of teacher performance in the classroom that I've ever come across. He is probably the biggest advocate for our teachers that there is in this country. The conference that I attended was, for me, an eye-opener. Parker Palmer was hosting this conference. It met in Connecticut at the home offices of Aetna Insurance. For me, it was a revolution, because this was the first time that I became directly aware and exposed to the existence of corporate-run universities. This was the first exposure that I had personally to the reality of what was happening in higher education around the country. Namely, that our colleges and universities had been unable to meet the needs of employers for so long that many companies, many corporations were driven to open up their own training educational operations so that they could train and educate their own employees in the needs of that particular profession or that particular industry. One of the largest and most successful at that time, and this would have been, again, 30 years ago, was Aetna Insurance, who had an absolutely incredibly impressive university operation outside Hartford, Connecticut. And that's where Parker Palmer's conference was to take place, within the corporate setting of Aetna Insurance. And as part of the conference, many of the executives of Aetna appeared before the group, the attendees, the participants. I was one. to explain the setting we were in, the money that went into it, and the situation that gave rise to it. Namely, that Aetna had been waiting for years for colleges and universities to begin to prepare and adequately train employees for success, not so much in the insurance industry, but in the educational process which drove corporate America. In other words, the skills that made for success in corporate America in the 80s, in the 1980s, was woefully deficient in our colleges and universities. It almost seemed like the private sector and the public sector couldn't even communicate. I knew, because my career up to that time had been spent in higher education, I knew what the problem was from the higher education side of the ledger. I had been around university and college professors long enough to know that they felt that their degrees and their experience basically made them the experts in higher education. And for corporate interlopers to come along and even suggest that corporations, companies, private sector, profit-driven entities should have some say, some control over curriculum was anathema to most college and university professors that I know. I'm the expert. This is my field. This is where I shine. This is where I have all the expertise. So the message to corporate America was, you come to us and you let us know what your needs are, and we'll tell you what you need in order to properly educate and properly train your employees. And for corporate America, that was never good enough, because all of it was done, the entire thrust of education was from the direction of the university classroom, with little if any awareness about the needs of corporate America, the needs of the market, the needs of the private sector, the needs to serve customers, the need for interactive skills, the kinds of interactive skills that made it possible for representatives of corporations to adequately meet the needs of customers. It almost seemed like there was a total disconnect between the classroom and the workplace. Parker Palmer's 4-day conference was intended principally to close this gap, to try to educate each side to the priorities of the other, to make corporate executives aware of why university and college professors was so protective and so unwilling to surrender any control over curriculum to these corporations. On the other hand, as a university professor, actually at that time I was not in a university, I was at a community college. This was the first time that I had been exposed to corporate executives who were explaining to me their priorities, what their needs were. More importantly, they were telling me why the way I taught history and political science was not meeting their needs. I really had no idea up until this conference what their needs were. That was the purpose of the grant under which, it was a federal grant, under which Parker Palmer's conference was being held. For me, it was one of the most informative, mind-blowing 4-day conferences I had ever attended in my life. When I got back to Richmond, Virginia, I set out to test much of the information that I brought back from that conference. I contacted corporations in and around Richmond, Virginia. I talked to executives in Richmond. Richmond happens to be the capital of the state of Virginia. I went to state office buildings and I contacted state agencies. And I asked them a number of questions that emerged from this conference about what their needs were, what their training needs were. First I asked them whether in fact their needs were being adequately addressed, adequately served by colleges and universities in the Richmond area. And the answers that I received were almost invariably not at all. What many corporations and companies in and around Richmond said was, we have discovered over the years that if we want our employees successfully trained, we're going to have to do it ourselves because we can't seem to make a dent in curriculum. University professors seem to be taking pre-designed curriculum out of their back pockets and presenting it to us and telling us this is our needs when they don't even take the time to ask us what our needs are. In other words, I realized from my own research that Parker Palmer's conference was right on. He was very successfully and adequately defining the problem. I knew, and I had many friends, colleagues at principally at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond. And I talked to them, members of the business faculty, members of the Medical College of Virginia, many of those who handle curriculum at the Medical College of Virginia for doctors and nurses and various other things about their education, about their training, and to what extent the mainstream university was meeting their needs. I began to see the same need that Parker Palmer had seen when he wrote his grant. So consequently, in the late 80s, I set up a company, my own company. I called it Training Arts. And basically, my goal was to try to bring together the needs of the classroom, the higher education classroom, and blend them successfully with the needs of the workplace, the needs of employers. Because I saw a disconnect. I saw a situation where the conversations that needed to happen were not happening. And I began to develop training modules in areas like ethics and business ethics. I began to incorporate Aristotle and Plato, for example, into some training situations, training modules that I was delivering to corporations. But what I was doing was incorporating the needs of corporate training and merging them with the writings of Plato and Aristotle and Montaigne and many other philosophers from my background in higher education. And I began to experience what I believed was very successful results. When I came to West Virginia in 1991, I have mentioned many times I lost my job through a cutback because of a decline in student population at the community college. And when the opportunity emerged to come to Southern West Virginia and re-enter higher education, I took it. And I came to West Virginia with all of this background and all of this due credit to Parker Palmer and all the things that I had learned from him. And I brought it with me to West Virginia. So when I saw an article this weekend by Parker Palmer I jumped at the opportunity to totally capture the essence of that piece. I've read a number of books that Parker Palmer has written in recent years. One of the ones I recommend is entitled The Courage to Teach. It's one of the most insightful presentations of the challenge of classroom teaching that I've ever read. Because Parker Palmer is one of those people that really believes in education in its most philosophical setting, if you will. The most idealistic approach to good education matches exactly Parker Palmer's priorities. So when he talks about the courage to teach, he's talking about the potential, the very positive potential that a teacher brings to the classroom and brings potentially to every student in that class. It's one of the most exciting, optimistic, visionary approaches to teaching that I've ever read. And many people have come to appreciate Parker Palmer over the years. As he continues to write, he continues to give guest addresses and lectures around the world, not just here in America, but in Europe as well. Anyway, Parker Palmer's piece in the New York Times this weekend is entitled My 5 New Years, Not Resolutions, but Revolutions. And Palmer talks about, at the beginning of this piece, Parker Palmer talks about the fact that when he sat down to write this article, which he knew would be published around New Year's Eve, he meant to entitle it My New Year's Resolutions. And inadvertently, instead of resolution with an S, he typed in revolutions with a V. And he started to change it. And then, at the point where he was ready to correct his mistake, he stopped. And this is a quote from the article, and he said to himself, no, that's what I want to write about. Suddenly, I became grateful, he says, for the creativity in my fingers. Because inadvertently, I had put down exactly what it was that I wanted to say on this New Year's. And this was his intent. Quote, I want to write about my resolve to commit to a few of the revolutions that we need if we're going to regain our humanity in 2016, unquote. Think about an article that's going to address the points which will help us recover our humanity as a society, as a civilization, as a nation. I want to write about my resolve to commit to a few of the revolutions that we need if we're going to regain our humanity in 2016. The implication is that much of what's happening in our society, in our nation, is raising serious questions, at least in his mind, as to whether, in fact, we are losing our humanity, losing our sense of concern for each other in this modern world. And he comes up with 5 specific revolutions that we need to take on in order to meet the objectives of this particular piece, which is to recover at least a portion of our own humanity in 2016. And then he quotes from Pete Seeger. Many of us, of course, are familiar with Pete Seeger and Pete Seeger's role in protests and music in the late 90s. And he reminds us that Pete Seeger, inscribed on his banjo, had the following words, quote, "This machine surrounds hate and forces it to surrender," unquote. Inscribed on Pete Seeger's banjo, "This machine surrounds hate and forces it to surrender." And then Parker Palmer launches into the 5 revolutions that he believes will help us recover our humanity in 2016. I didn't say make it possible for us to recover our humanity. Make it possible for us to begin to recover our humanity. I'd like to address these because I think they fit so well into the objectives and the vision which gave rise to the Virtual Center from the very beginning. The first one, and let me tell you ahead of time, that Parker Palmer is not only a visionary, he's a philosopher. He deals in philosophical principles. He deals in principle. He deals in vision. He deals in abstract issues. And yet his commitment is to take these abstractions from the world of the abstract and find ways to apply them in the world that we all live in. His first revolution is what he calls the revolution against our fear of otherness and against those who manipulate this fear for their own self-serving ends. Our fear of otherness, our fear of those who are different than we are, a fear which plays itself out in identifying others as others who are separate from and potentially a threat to us. And his point is that once we begin to function around the idea of otherness, we tend to put all of those who differ from us into separate categories, all of them other than us, other than our own category. And by definition, we tend to fear each of those as threatening ourselves, as threatening our civilization, our values, the principles upon which we tend to put a premium. And he points out, and this is, I think, the significant part, he points out that those who seem to be making a living in creating the idea of otherness and helping to create the fear of this otherness do so for very self-serving reasons. They have their own particular agenda. Let me just go on and read what he says, and I think once you hear the way Parker Palmer describes this particular revolution, I think you'll understand what this means. He says, "I want to stand in solidarity with those whose lives have been made even more difficult by the ignorance, cruelty, and shamelessness of the Donald Trumps of this world and their minions. When I hear people speaking against Muslims or Mexicans, to take but 2 examples, I need to say, and this is his message as to how we participate in revolutions against this concept of otherness. Parker Palmer says, quote, "This is what we need to say, quote, Your words are personally offensive to me. I am one with the people that you're insulting. And I can't remain silent while you put my sisters and brothers down, unquote. I may not change anybody's mind, he says, but I need to witness to my membership in the human community whenever I get the chance. What he is asking for here is people's willingness to take on the bigotry, to take on the idea of opposition to other nationalities, other peoples who are different than us. To take on the idea that those who are different from us threaten us and are therefore pose a threat to us that we must take action against. Whether, as Donald Trump is talking about, we exclude them, we throw them out of our nation, and we build walls to keep them out. Dr. Palmer's idea of humanity is the idea of recognizing and bringing to the fore those aspects of humanity that bring us or link us together, not those things that separate us. Parker Palmer believes that the revolution that must happen is the revolution that emphasizes those things we have in common and discourages those things which separate us. What he is saying here is that those people who want to create this sense of fear want to highlight the differences which separate us rather than those elements of humanity that link us together, usually are doing what they are doing for their own self-interest. And by mentioning by name Donald Trump, of course, he's talking specifically about Donald Trump's political campaign as it is being played out for all of us to see. So what Parker Palmer is asking us to do then in this new year is stand up to the bigotry, stand up to the hostility, not let people get away with saying the kinds of things they are saying about other people, other religions, other nationalities, other races, about those people whose background makes them appear to be different from us. Because as long as we remain separate and hostile, we will live in the world that we left behind from 2015. What he's hoping for is that 2016 will be the world in which we begin to bring this sense of humanity back into the picture. I think already we are beginning to get the idea as to where Parker Palmer is coming from. If you go to his second revolution, it deals with the issue of racism in America. The second revolution he talks about is a revolution against the state of denial in which most white Americans live, when we refuse to acknowledge the power of white privilege and white supremacy in our own lives. There are many people out there who are making a career, a profession of making us feel that we American whites are victims of an overemphasis on an overly supportive environment for other races other than the white race. What Parker Palmer is asking us to do is look seriously at the realities of the world we live in and the extent to which race tends to drive that world to our own advantage. He says, quote, "This revolution begins at home, in my own heart. I've never known," he says, "a white person who was pulled over for driving while white or tracked through a store for shopping while white. But I've known many who believe that the very idea of white privilege insults the way they've worked hard and played by the rules. And I can feel the same evasiveness in myself. If white people want to join the fight to bring racism down, we need to begin by coming clean about the benefits that accrue to us as long as racism reigns." What he is saying to us as white Americans is that we need to take seriously the advantages that being white in this society make available to us, that others of different races don't have. There's no way we can collect a number of statistics in order to try to make the case that allegations of racism in our society do not exist. What he's saying is we need to look honestly at the situation and recognize that indeed it does. And we need to begin to turn this around in 2016, Parker Palmer is saying. We have a little bit less. We have about 8-10 minutes left in our program today. Hopefully I'll be able to get through these. The third revolution that Parker Palmer talks about relates specifically to K through 12 teachers in our classrooms. As I mentioned, this has been long a major area of concern for Dr. Palmer. He talks about the revolution against the nonstop attacks on our K-12 teachers in our public schools. Most of the problems, he said, that we blame on public education begin upstream. For example, in the poverty that has nearly 1/4 of our kids coming to school too hungry for their brains to work well. So why do we blame teachers for children's failure to learn? Then double down on their burden by pretending to solve the problem with punitive high-stakes testing. The only winners right now are those who want to force failure on public education in order to make privatization a more attractive option. Basically, what he's saying is that the self-interest of those who have most to gain by attacking our public schools are those people who want to privatize, of those people who want to build so much hostility and so much negativism to our public schools and to the teachers who teach in those schools, that people will be led to move in the direction of privatization, of charter schools, of vouchers. And the whole idea of equal access to education for everybody that this nation has stood upon for so long will be lost. Palmer says, I want to join with those who say enough. This demonic scheme is crushing teachers and kids alike, and we will all pay dearly for it in the end. Let's stop evading the real issues. Let's deal with the upstream problems so teachers can begin to help kids learn. And what he's talking about is fixing the negative circumstances under which many of our children live. I've talked to a number of teachers who have told me, if you knew the specific home environments that these kids come to school from, you would begin to realize that it's a miracle that they even get here. And here in Appalachia, I can see it. I've talked to many people who have confirmed it. Our local United Way, for example, has begun to raise money, to contribute money to buy shoes for kids in our schools. Our United Way has put out the word in all of our elementary schools throughout this county to send the names of kids who are in need of shoes. Many of them are wearing shoes lined with cardboard, shoes that are taped together. It's unbelievable. How can we expect these kids to perform and to compete and to learn with these kinds of basic physical and human needs? So if we are to deal with upstream problems first, then that means doing everything we can to make certain that kids come to school ready to learn and able to learn. And as I mentioned, this for Parker Palmer has long been a priority for him. His fourth revolution deals with the issue of guns. I'd like to return to this in tomorrow's program, if I may. And what he talks about is a revolution against gun-related policies driven by what he calls the delusional mentality of policymakers and power brokers. Palmer says there is a link between mental illness and gun violence. But I'm not talking about the shooters right now. I'm talking about the people who have power over gun policy in this country. It's urgent, and I think we're going to see action coming out of the White House within the next 24 hours on the issue of guns. And already the negatives and the opposition is lining up for the counterattack, as we know. So I encourage you to keep an eye open this evening and early in the morning in order to pick up on the president's policies, anticipated policies on some sort of regulation against the availability of guns in our society, and be particularly aware of the negatives lining up against them. Palmer says, I'm talking about the people who have power over gun policy in this country. It's urgent, he says, that we find some way to cure, or at least contain, the delusional minds that keep repeating more guns and Second Amendment as the way to end the terrifying torrent of headlines about yet another shooting. The murderous results of this madness were on display almost every day in 2015. I'm quite certain that this is not what the framers of the Bill of Rights had in mind. The more guns insanity poses a grave threat to public health, and if we can't cure it, we must contain it by legal and cultural means. If you don't stop it, you'll never turn it around. You don't have a chance. And it seems to me that's what President Obama is poised to do, I believe, tomorrow. From what I understand, he's meeting with the Attorney General this afternoon and giving her a final run-through on the policy initiatives that he intends to take, which he plans to announce tomorrow. And I'd like to return to that in tomorrow's program if I can, this issue of guns. I think this is an incredibly important one. I've come across an article. In fact, I think one of our listeners I have to thank for the link that led me to this article on the Second Amendment, which I think all of us need to be familiar with. So I'd like to deal with that in tomorrow's program. Parker Palmer's fifth resolution, and we're at 55 minutes after the hour, so I've only got about 3 minutes before we have to sign off in today's program, and we'll pick up on a couple of these things tomorrow. His fifth one is the revolution against the fantasy that a few of us can live secure private lives while ignoring our complicity in conditions that put many others at mortal risk. Many of us believe that we can live separate from and away from the problems which confront so many of the citizenry in our society. Palmer says, I've been contemplating the lessons to be learned from the well-known mental experiment. This is the one that I think is going to require some attention in tomorrow's program. So let me lay it out here, and maybe you can be thinking about it this evening, and then we'll return to it tomorrow. Palmer says, I've been contemplating the lessons to be learned from the well-known mental experiment of shrinking the world to a village of 100 people. In other words, if you take the entire world and you imagine that it's shrunk down to 100 people, and the same percentages or proportions apply, which apply in today's world, then you can actually attach numbers to many of the realities in our situation. If our world was shrunk down to a village of 100 people, then this is what we'd be dealing with. In that village, demographers tell us 5 people would control nearly 1/3 of the world's wealth. 1/3 of the wealth of the entire village of 100 people would be controlled by 5 people. All 5 would be U.S. citizens. Of the 100 residents in our village, 68 of them would live on less than $2 a day. 50 would be malnourished. If that village were built on a hill, I would live up top in splendid isolation with the other 4 U.S. citizens. How long would it be, I wonder, before the folks at the bottom of the hill would rush our gated community, not out of greed, but simply to keep themselves and their children alive? Even if they didn't, how well would I be able to sleep at night? So those are the 5 revolutions that Parker Palmer believes all of us need to think about as we begin the year of 2016. I'd like to return to a few of them tomorrow, namely the last 2. The one dealing with guns and the concept of the shrunken village and what that might mean in terms of the issues associated with things like inequality in our society and all the rest of it. But I think it's time for us to sign off today. It's 58 minutes after the hour. I want to thank all of you for tuning in to today's program at the Virtual Center. I want to invite you back tomorrow, Tuesday. Let me remind you that on Tuesdays, we begin our program 1/2 hour later than we do on Mondays and Wednesdays. So tomorrow's program will begin at 1:30 Eastern Time, and it will extend from 1:30 p.m. to 3 p.m. So it'll be 90 minutes long rather than the 120-minute programs that we deliver on Mondays and Wednesdays. I want to thank you so much for your willingness to tune into the Virtual Center. I want to thank you for your continued support of the Virtual Center and of the Head On Radio Network. I spoke about that earlier in our program today. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Winter has finally made it into Appalachia. We have a little bit of snow on the ground. Our temperatures this evening are projected to go down into the single numbers. So we're going to get a taste of winter for the first time in this entire season. This is Bill O'Brien thanking you so much for your support, for your willingness to continue to support the Virtual Center. Be good to each other, and we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you.